This lecture is about Sufism and Sufi or mystical approaches to the interpretation of the Quran. In this lecture, we will cover a very brief introduction to Sufism, how Sufism developed in early Islam, and some of the Sufis' key ideas about Quranic interpretation, with a particular emphasis on the notion of inner meanings. And we will look at some examples. So, what is Sufism and how do Sufis approach the Quran? Sometimes we refer to Sufism by the word mysticism and Sufi by the word mystic. So, we are using these terms interchangeably. Sufism is about the emphasis on the spiritual dimension of Islam. It is a spiritual path that seeks to attain God or God's presence or God's pleasure through refining one's soul or self and by undertaking various spiritual exercises. It also involves taming the ego and setting aside any worldly attachments that might disrupt one's experience of God, or that might distract a person from remembrance of God. Sufism is also about constant remembrance of God and keeping God in one's mind all the time. This remembrance of God, or in Arabic, dhikr, dhikr, is a very important part of Sufi practice. Dhikr, or remembrance, is mentioned very frequently in the Quran. For Sufis, remembrance or dhikr refers to invocation of God's name, or some or all of God's most beautiful names or attributes. This invocation can be silently or loudly, or in a group or individually. Some of the key Quranic phrases that are often used in this dhikr or remembrance include the profession of faith. The phrase is La ilaha illallah. There is no God but God. Then there is the phrase Subhanallah, meaning glory be to God, and Alhamdulillah, praise be to God, and Allahu Akbar, meaning God is the greatest. And of course, there are many other phrases. So, when did Sufism emerge? The word Sufi comes from the Arabic language. At least that's one understanding of where the word comes from. Some would trace the lineage of Sufism back to Prophet Muhammad. Others would say, no, this is a movement that developed later on after the death of the Prophet, and it wasn't an authentic part of the early practice of the Muslims. So there is a debate about how authentic Sufism is and whether it was something that was practiced or that existed during Prophet Muhammad's time. We do know that the word Sufi seems to be in the historical records from about the 8th century of the Common Era. It was used to describe people who were wearing coarse wool garments as a sign of poverty or as a form of self-deprivation. These people were putting aside comfort and denying themselves worldly pleasure. This is about renunciation of the worldly pleasures. At this time, Sufism was seen as a kind of trend that emphasized piety or asceticism. This basically means that one has to renounce the world in order to become closer to God. A key part of this is the idea of love of God. It is not so much worshipping God or spending lots of time in prayers to get the reward of paradise or to be saved from hell. This may be a consideration, of course. The focus is on just love of God, not for any reward. Both these aspects, that is, renunciation of the world and the love of God, can be seen in the various expressions attributed to, for example, the famous female Sufi, Rabia al-Adawiyya, died 01 of the Common Era. There are graphic stories about her. For example, how she slept on a brick and someone, for example, gave her a pillow, but she threw it out because it was too luxurious for her. She was one of the few well-known female Sufis. This is one of her sayings, and it kind of shows her deep desire to seek God and to worship Him. Let me read it for you. O Lord, if I worship you from fear of hell, burn me in hell. If I worship you from hope of paradise, bar me from its gates. But if I worship you for yourself alone, then grace me forever the splendor of your face. Here, Rabia is addressing God. By around the 8th century of the Common Era, the Sufis were not really a distinct group. They were individuals spread out across different places and different cities around the Muslim world or the Islamic world at the time, who had different practices. But they all had certain things in common, like the desire to seek God and to renounce worldly things that distracted them from God. By around the 9th century of the Common Era, there seems to have emerged a distinct group of people in places like Baghdad who were called Sufis, who used mystical practices or Sufi practices. Gradually, various movements emerged that we today call Sufism. I'm not going to cover the history of Sufism in this lecture, as my focus is very much on how Sufis approach the Quran, and to do so very briefly. The early Sufis were mostly concerned about experiencing God or the presence of God in their daily lives, so to speak. For them, human life was a journey towards obtaining God consciousness. In other words, an ongoing attempt to draw nearer to God. They did this through self discipline and sometimes asceticism and seclusion and outward poverty. We also have in this early period a number of Sufis or mystics who were very well known for their ecstatic utterances that were considered heretical by many Muslims or even blasphemous by many Muslims. For example, the Sufi Mansur al-Hallaj died 922, who lived as a contemporary with the very famous Junaid, a Sufi from Baghdad. Al-Hallaj is reported as saying in Arabic, An al-Haq, or in translation, I am the truth. Now, can you think of why it might be theologically problematic to say, I am the truth? Well, Al-Haq, or the truth, is one of the names of God. It is quite common to refer to God among Muslims not only as Allah, but to say, for example, Al-Haq, or to use one of his other names or attributes like Ar-Rahman or Ar-Rahim. By saying, I am the truth, or An al-Haq, Al-Hallaj is actually appearing to make this claim about himself, something that is usually attributed to God. But when Al-Hallaj says this, he is not trying to be heretical or blasphemous, at least from his point of view. Some scholars would interpret what Al-Hallaj said and would say, Hallaj is not saying that he is God or he is the truth. And they would say that his expression has to be understood not literally. In other words, what he is saying is that I and everything in this world should be considered nothing. We are not real. The only being that is real, or the only one that exists, is God, nothing else. But let's not worry about this at this stage. I just wanted to point out that when we look at Sufis, some of them would have uttered phrases that will be considered blasphemous or even heretical by other Muslims. But Sufis have their own ways of understanding these phrases or statements. Let us look briefly at the development of Sufism, particularly the later period. So, around the 10th century of the Common Era, Sufism began to consolidate and spread into various parts of the then Islamic world, in places like Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, etc. We begin to see dedicated buildings for Sufis in various cities, which served as meeting places, but also as places where a Sufi master would teach his followers or disciples. It was a kind of like a master apprentice type of relationship, where the master would teach or guide his followers in the way of the Sufi path. One of the core ideas of Sufism was that people needed special training or special guidance to reach this higher level of God consciousness that Sufis were seeking. Sufis saw this journey towards God consciousness as a path. It wasn't something you obtained straight away, but something that you progressed towards over time with the help of someone more learned, someone who had already traveled the path. A variety of Sufi orders developed during this period. Each Sufi order would be around a particular Sufi master or sheikh. Different Sufi orders had different spiritual practices and training. The end of Sufi path was, of course, God or God's pleasure or experience of God. As Sufism grew, they began to develop more sophisticated theoretical and even some theological ideas. Ibn Arabi is a good example. He lived in Spain in the 14th century and he was a very prolific writer. He is most famous for his doctrine of the unity of being, or in Arabic, Wahdatul Wujud. This is a very complex doctrine and it is difficult to summarize this in a sentence. But it generally refers to this idea that if you have annihilated yourself, then you kind of realize that no being other than God exists. God is the only entity that has real existence. There's a lot of debate about what this unity of being is, according to Ibn Arabi, and I'm not going to go into those details. If you're interested, of course, you can read about that. Let us look at Sufism and the interpretation of the Quran. As I mentioned earlier, Sufis emphasized the spiritual dimension of Islam instead of the legal or theological or other dimensions. So their focus is on the spiritual dimension. For Sufis, this idea of layers of meaning of the Quranic text is important. Sufis were interested in exploring questions to do with knowledge of God and the nature of human existence. They sought to understand the deeper meanings of the Quranic text rather than focusing on its literal meaning. In other words, the Quran's inner meanings. So there was this idea that the Quran had several layers of meaning, primarily an external layer, which was perhaps the literal meaning of the text, and an inner layer, which is the inner spiritual meaning of the text. The external or the outer meaning can be referred to sometimes as exoteric, and the inner meaning can be referred to as esoteric. There is a hadith or tradition of the Prophet that is often mentioned in relation to these two layers of meaning, the inner and the outer, or the exterior or the interior. Ibn Mas'ud, one of the companions of the Prophet, reported, "The Messenger of God said, the Quran was sent down in 7 readings. Each Quranic verse has an exterior and an interior." Such a tradition or hadith can be used by the Sufis to argue that even according to the Prophet Muhammad, there are these two layers of meaning. And then they can build all sorts of ideas to develop this concept of inner meanings. Another early mystical figure is Ja'far as-Sadiq died 765. Many of the Sufi lineages trace their lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad through Ja'far as-Sadiq. Ja'far as-Sadiq argued that the Quran had four layers of meaning. First, the very obvious, that is, the literal meaning of the text, or in Arabic, ibara, which was understandable to ordinary Muslims or ordinary believers. The second is the illusion or ishara, which was understandable to the spiritual elect among the believers, meaning people like Sufis. Third, the subtle meanings, or in Arabic, lataif, which were only understandable to the elect of the elect. This would be really the top end of the Sufism, Sufi masters. And finally, the realities, or haqa'iq in Arabic, which would be only understandable to the prophets. Jafar Sadiq wasn't the only figure who saw the Quran as having several layers of meaning. This idea of different layers of meaning is also expressed by the famous theologian and Sufi, whose name is Ghazali, died 1111. Ghazali says, and I quote, "There are many subtle meanings of the mysteries of the Quran which dawn upon the hearts of those who have devoted themselves to invocation or dhikr and reflection or fikr, but are not found in the books of commentary or tafsir in Arabic and remain unknown to the best commentators." This is in his famous work, The Revival of the Religious Sciences. Where does this knowledge of inner meanings of the Quran come from? It is not through rational argument or analysis. It's not through a hadith or tradition of the Prophet. It's not through a logical operation you can perform. For the Sufis, there are several means by which one can attain this knowledge or the inner meanings of the Quran that are hidden from the ordinary people. One way is through invocation of God or remembrance of God, or dhikr in Arabic, and of course leading to purification of the self, in Arabic nafs, from worldly attachments. And once the soul is purified, a kind of unveiling or illumination occurs. This unveiling or illumination is not something that can easily be explained, they would argue. So it's something that happens as a result of this spiritual purification. A question for us is, do inner meanings displace or replace outer meanings? Some Sufis would argue that the inner meanings of the Quran that are accessible to them have priority over the outer meaning. But this idea conflicts with the mainstream Muslim views about the Quran, its meaning, and interpretation. For Muslims, the Quran was revealed in Arabic language, and therefore its meanings should be accessible to those who are familiar with Arabic language and other necessary disciplines in Islam, such as Arabic linguistics and so forth. If Sufis insist on the primacy of inner meanings, they would face resistance from the broader community of scholars, the ulama. In fact, that's exactly what happened in the early centuries of Islam. Sufis and many of their ideas and practices were considered often a form of extremism, or at least those Sufis who went to extremes in their ideas and practices were considered to be so. But because Sufis were also emphasizing ideas such as love of God, or remembrance of God, or purification of the self, which are ideas that are very visible in the Quran and in the traditions of the Prophet, one cannot simply dismiss all Sufis and their practices as a bunch of extremists or forms of extremism. A lot of what Sufis practiced in terms of remembrance of God and the like were part of mainstream Muslim practices anyway. So there was a significant effort at purifying Sufism from extreme elements and bringing Sufism into what we might call mainstream Islam. The bad image that Sufism had because of various practices of certain Sufis and their statements had to be refined. This was the job of scholars like Al-Ghazali, died 1111, who himself was a very prominent theologian and a Sufi, particularly in his later life. Ghazali played a very important role in arguing that if we take the more extreme elements of Sufism away, Sufism could be considered part of mainstream Islam. You can see a lot of Ghazali's thinking around this issue in his works, such as the revival of religious sciences, or in Arabic, Ihya Ulumuddin. One of the key ideas in this project of bringing Sufism into mainstream Islam is about the inner and outer meanings. The basic idea was that, yes, there are inner and outer meanings of the Quran, but the claim of some Sufis that only inner meanings matter and outer meanings don't should be rejected. That means both the outer meaning, which is very much associated with Islamic law and theology, and the inner meanings that are often associated with Sufism or Sufis, should be considered as existing at the same time, and that both are legitimate ways of looking at the meanings of the Quran. Both have a role to play. So consider this as a kind of compromise of sorts. This is best expressed by a well-known 14th century scholar, Ala ad-Dawla as-Simnani, who says, and I quote, "Anyone who rejects the outer meaning of the Quran is a stubborn heretic or apostate. And anyone who rejects the inner meanings of the relevant Quranic verses after having affirmed their external sense is a stupid and anthropomorphic idiot. But the one who combines the outer and inner is a happy Sunni Muslim." So, who are the key opponents of Sufism, particularly in earlier times? Well, we could say that a large part of this rejection of Sufism comes from what we might call textualists, and those who are very much concerned about text and the literal meaning in the understanding of what Islam is all about. These people rejected various interpretations of the Quran that are not supported by what we might call the transmitted knowledge, or the traditions of the Prophet, or traditions that are attributed to the companions of the Prophet and the like. They rejected interpretations developed by various Sufis. For them, the Sufis were too excessive. Sufi practices were too excessive. A lot of Sufi interpretations were seen by these figures as interpretation by personal opinion, or in Arabic, ra'i, which is condemned by the Prophet. One of the key figures who critiqued Sufism and written extensively on this is someone by the name of Ibn al-Jawzi, died 1200. And Ibn Taymiyyah, died 1328, is also a good example of that. Let us look at some of the key ideas in the interpretation of the Quran by the Sufis. In order to understand how Sufis approach the Quran and its interpretation, we may need to look at a few ideas. We don't have time to go into a lot of detail here, but let me summarize some of them. First is a focus on allegorical expressions and symbols in the Quran. Example could be the story of the green man we met in an earlier lecture, or the letters with which some surahs of the Quran begin, such as Alif, Lam, Ra. These are Arabic letters with which a number of Quranic surahs begin. The second key idea is that there are additional layers of meaning beyond what appears to be at a literal level in a text. And the third is that meaning should be looked at as existing at two levels, the outer and inner. In Arabic, zahir and Batin. This is a kind of summary of what I was saying earlier. Let us look at some examples of Sufi interpretation. The first is the Qur'anic verse that says, "Purify my house for those who circumambulate it." Circumambulate is walking all the way around something. If we look at this at a fairly literal level, it seems to be about a command to purify Kaaba, which is in Mecca, for those who come to visit it. But Jafar Sadiq, whom I mentioned earlier, said the meaning of this is not the literal one, but the meaning is, according to him, purify the soul from any association with the disobedient ones and anything other than God. Jafar Sadiq is linking this verse not only to God's house, which is the Kaaba, but to that of the soul and to an association with anything other than God. That's a very mystical interpretation. Another example of interpretation by mystics or Sufis is from a much later period. This is from the 14th century. Again, another Quranic verse which says, "Do not come to prayers while intoxicated until you are able to know what you are saying, know in a state of ritual impurity." This is one of the Quranic verses on consumption of wine and prayer. And this is the earliest one in which the Muslims are told not to come to pray if they are intoxicated. One of the interpretations of this verse by a Sufi is that drunkenness and impurity signify here forgetfulness of God and attachment to the world. So even if you are sober, there are still things you need to do to purify yourself. This particular Sufi says to purify yourself of these things, you must be ritually pure and you must do remembrance of God and cleanse yourself of these things. Again, it is an interesting mystical interpretation of a verse that seems to be pretty clear at a literal level. Another example is Jesus and Mary. Both Jesus and Mary are significant symbols and figures in Sufi interpretation because of the nature of the Quranic passages about them or texts about them. The soul of Mary, which was purified through God's remembrance and prayers, and how her purity became the receptacle for the Holy Spirit, and of course, the pregnancy of Jesus is an interesting symbol for the Sufis. A key part of this reception of the Holy Spirit, so to speak, is the purity of the self of Mary and her connection to God. So the idea is that one has to be spiritually pure in order to have this connection to God. And for Sufis, Mary and Jesus are very good examples of that very thing. This is again an interesting aspect of Sufi interpretation. Letters with which some Quranic surahs begin. One Sufi interpreter of the Quran from the early period, roughly 9th century, was interested in working out what the disconnected letters or the letters that you find at the beginning of some of the chapters of the Quran meant. For this Sufi, his name is Tustari, which a very famous Sufi, believed these letters had an inner spiritual meaning, apart from their obvious external meaning as letters of Arabic alphabet. Tustari indicates that the disconnected letters found at the beginning of certain Quranic surahs or chapters refer in their interior or inner meaning to the names of God, and that the integration of these names into ritual acts of remembrance or dhikr facilitates the worshipper's two-way communication with God. Each book that God the Exalted has sent down has a secret, he says, and the secret of the Quran lies in the letters at the beginnings of the chapters. He goes on to say that they are names and attributes, such as when God says Alif Lam Mim Sad, or Alif Lam Mim Ra, or Kaf Ha Ya Ain Sad, or Ta Sin Mim, or Ha Mim, and Ain Sin Kaf. These are all Arabic letters with which various Quranic surahs begin. He goes on to say that when these letters are brought together, they make up God's greatest name. That is, if a letter is taken from each group of the opening letters of the chapters, Alif, Lam, Ra, Ha, Mim, together with Nun, they form the name Ar-Rahman, or the Merciful. When you look at the word Ar-Rahman, you can see that it consists of Alif, Lam, Ra, and Ha, Mim, and Nun. Again, an interesting interpretation. There are lots of debates among Muslim scholars about the meanings of these letters that are at the beginning of the surahs. This is a Sufi interpretation. Another element of the Quran that was often interpreted by the Sufis is the discourses on paradise. Sufis believe that some of the passages that are very vivid and physical in the Quran about the paradise are susceptible to this idea of layers of meaning. For example, Al-Ghazali, we met earlier, said that one's understanding of paradise depends on one's level of spiritual attainment. If someone is just an ordinary believer, for him or her, paradise is a place or object with many material and wonderful pleasures. But for those who are spiritually purified and have attained a higher level in this world, paradise is simply a symbol for attaining God or God's pleasure or the presence of God or experience of God. Again, this is a very different way of looking at paradise. Let us look at very briefly at the symbol of light and the verse of light. In chapter 24, verse 35, the verse says, God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The likeness of his light is of a niche, wherein is a lamp. The lamp is in a glass. The glass is like a glittering star, lit from a blessed olive tree, neither of the east nor of the west. Its oil well nigh shines, though no fire touches it. Light upon light. Interpret this verse. The verse is susceptible to many different interpretations. In fact, many scholars have written extensively on what this verse means and the symbolism in this. One of the most common ways this was approached was by looking at what the verse mentions as symbols. Basically, each element in this verse seems to be symbolizing something. Because we are dealing with Sufi interpretations, let's look at one of the Sufis' attempt at interpreting this, and very, very briefly. Here I'm presenting the interpretation of this by Qushayri, a very famous Sufi, died 1072. It's a lengthy discussion, but this is a kind of summary of that. It says, God is light, the origin of all existence. And then he provides these meanings for each of the symbols. The verse mentions the likeness of his light. He says it's about the believer's heart. That there's reference to niche, says that is the breast of the believer or the chest of the believer, where the heart is. And the verse makes reference to oil that feeds the light. He says it is the knowledge of God. This oil is the knowledge of God. And the verse mentions the tree is neither of the east nor of the west. This is referring to the balanced state of fear and hope in God. Again, two very important concepts in Sufism, which I don't have time to go into right now. Then there's reference to light upon light. And he says this is one's own efforts to reach God, added to God's grace in the gift of direct witnessing. I made some brief references to this idea of opponents of Sufism. Let me just say a couple of words on this a bit more. Like other schools of thought and practice within Islam, Sufis sometimes often faced opposition for their ideas. Sometimes they were targeted by the ulama or the scholars for following what the ulama saw as extreme ideas. At other times, Sufis were targeted by political authorities who were uncomfortable with their teachings or with the influence they had in society. Sometimes Sufis were also criticized by other Sufis for excessive practices. I mentioned earlier the example of Ibn al-Jawzi, who strongly criticized the Sufis for not sticking to a literal reading of the Quran. I also mentioned earlier Al-Ghazali, who criticized certain aspects of Sufism, but Ghazali was himself a Sufi. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, Ghazali played a very important role in bringing Sufism into mainstream Sunni Islam. Let us look briefly at Sufism in the modern period. In the modern period, Sufism fell out of favor in many parts of the Muslim world. Sufism was seen as superstitious or irrational, particularly among many modernist Muslims. Modernist Muslims had a lot of difficulties with what Sufism was and what it represented, and the kinds of challenges Sufism posed to Muslim thought and Muslim practices and so forth in the modern period. Apart from modernist Muslims, there is another group of Muslims who are also very uncomfortable with Sufism. I'm referring to the Salafis in the modern period. I mentioned in an earlier lecture that Salafis believe that in order to practice Islam, one simply has to go back to the time of the Prophet and find out what the Quran said or what the Prophet said on particular issues. For them, much of the technical disciplines in Islam that developed around law and theology and linguistics, for example, and of course Sufism, should not be seen as terribly important. If one can read what is in the Quran and what is in the Sunnah or traditions of the Prophet, that should be sufficient to understand the basic beliefs, practices, and ethical and moral values, in general, guidance a Muslim should follow. For those who are opposed to Salafis, this kind of view of Islam and Islamic disciplines is very simplistic. Opponents of Salafis would argue that Muslim scholars and theologians and commentators on the Quran, as well as mainstream Sufis, have been trying to do exactly what the Salafis are saying that they are doing. That is, understand what the Quran and the Prophet said and then try to apply that in the legal, theological, and spiritual areas. Opponents of Salafis would argue that if we bypass Islamic disciplines and efforts of Muslim jurists and theologians, it would be very hard to get a clear sense of what was happening at the time of the Prophet. This is not a time for us to get into this debate about Salafism and Sufism. And I just wanted to mention this point because in the modern period, a lot of opposition to Sufism comes from primarily Muslim modernists as well as the Salafis. Today, Sufism is still an important part of the Islamic religious experience. It has even spread to Western countries. Wherever you find Muslims, there are Sufis. Sufism used to be a very powerful force in Muslim societies right up to the modern period. In the modern period, its influence is a lot less, but it still exists. For many Muslims, Sufism is, in its more mainstream form, is an important part of their life. In summary, this lecture has tried to give you some sense of another approach to interpretation of the Quran, that is, what we might call the mystical approach or the Sufi approach. Of course, there are many approaches within Sufism, it's not just one. In this, there is a lot of emphasis on the inner meanings of the Quran and how one can attain those meanings and whether there should be some balance in holding onto the outer and inner meanings of the Quran. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more lectures in this series as we explore the Quran's history, themes, and interpretation, as well as related debates today. Subscribe and turn on notifications to catch the next lecture in the series.